All right. Okay. Well, this was a little different. Commission review time. This one was a book, and for the first time since I've started taking book commissions, it's a book I've read before. It is Homeland by R.A. Salvatore. I'll put the image up there. And I read this back in middle school. I think it was seventh grade, seventh or eighth grade. I think it was seventh. I think it was seventh grade when I read this. And I read the trilogy. This was the first Forgotten Realms book I read. It was the first book I read featuring the character of Dris Duerden, and I've read other stuff since then. I've read the Halfling Gems trilogy. I read the Legacy trilogy, the one that followed those. This was what I read first though, which is the chronological first one, although it came out after the Halfling Gem. Um, I don't think that's the name of the whole trilogy. That's just the name of the first book. I forget what the overall trilogy was called. But in any case, I read these first, and I liked them a lot at the time. So this gave me the interesting experience of going back and re-experiencing a book that I liked a lot when I was quite a bit younger and had a more limited life experience and a much different perception of myself. So it was interesting to go back and see how it held up, and it does in some ways. In some ways, not as much. I'll get into sort of the nuts and bolts in that. Let's talk a bit about what this is for anyone who hasn't read it. Drizzt Do'Urden is a drow. That's the Dark Elves in D&D, the Forgotten Realms setting, and he's easily the most famous character of that particular race. He's a master fighter, wields two scimitars. He's been on loads of adventures. And this tells the origin of him, like very literally. It starts shortly before his birth. So it's his birth, his early days, his education as a fighter, his learning of the nature of his people and what is expected of him in the very cruel drow society that he has been born into. And I'm not really going to consider this a spoiler. This is very much the first part of a trilogy. While it tells a standalone story, like the trilogy is in three parts. It's this, which ends with him leaving his home, and then it's two more books of how he eventually ends up at the point where he shows up in the other stories. So this is pretty much almost entirely set within the Underdark, which is a subterranean setting, and in the city of Menzoberranzan, which is the Drow capital city. And they live very unpleasant lives. It's a matriarchal society. That's not why it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant because they worship Loth the Spider Queen, who is whoo. So the life of a male in general is already not great, but that's not to portray the men as oh, poor them, they're subjugated. No, the vast majority of them are awful as well. But Drizzt has not only a high degree of skill, innate skill, not only with weapons, which is his specialty, but also with magic. He could have been a great wizard, but he's not. And I know that sounds a little like overpowered, a little Mary Suey. But what makes it work is, despite him coming in with innate talent, the story still crafts and earns the idea that he is as skilled as he is. While he has a high level of innate talent, he works his butt off to get as good as he is. And he's trained by the best weapons master, who he eventually finds out is his father, Zach Nefane, who is the closest to him in terms of having any kind of what we would consider to be a standard moral compass, which is, killing's kind of wrong, actually. Zach Nefane has already accepted he will never be able to leave the Drow society. So he has found a way for him to live to the best of his abilities while not engaging in the worst parts of Drow society. Whereas Drizzt he really doesn't want any part of any of it. And then there's the rest of his family, most of whom are awful. And again, that's true of nearly all the Drow that are out there. It was interesting going back and remembering like what parts were included in this. Because like when you read a trilogy when you're in middle school, the aspects of it kind of bleed together. I'd forgotten which parts were where. Like one of my favorite characters from this series is a mercenary named Jarlaxle. He's not in this. He shows up later. But there's plenty of good stuff in here, and it's very well paced in terms of it, because it does very significant leaps in time, aided partially because Drow, being a form of elf, are, they live for multiple centuries, so it'll make leaps of years, a decade even. But it works because we still feel like we get all the information going into that period of time that's going to be skipped over, and then we come in at the tail end of it to get the wrap up on it, so it still feels complete. That happens with various aspects of Drizzt and his education, in fighting and murder and Drow society. So it's paced well. R.A. Salvatore is exceptionally good at writing fight scenes. And what I mean by that is he is able, without getting too bogged down and without it becoming laborious, he is able to describe individual attack motions, like what each person's hand is doing at a given point, so you get a really clear picture of the fight blow for blow. He's very good at that, but also knows when not to use it, knows when to go shorthand and just describe it as a flurry of blows. He knows when to deploy that skill, which is good because, again, it could have gotten real tedious otherwise, because there's other aspects of his writing that do get a bit tedious. R.A. Salvatore overwrites a bit. I think the best way I can describe that is by just reading you the literal first sentence of this book. Never does a star grace this land with a poet's light of twinkling mysteries, nor does the sun send to hear its rays of warmth and life. That is his way of saying this place is dark and sees no sun. And that level of overwriting can work. And you might even think to yourself, okay, so it's a bit poetic, but like it's the start. It's okay. Yeah, except he does that a lot. He does that a lot. And he'll continue to attach the same superlatives and adjectives onto something after we know that. Like, I don't think he ever stops calling, like whenever the Drow, because they all have this ability to create these little globes of complete darkness that you can't see in no matter what kind of eyesight you have. And he always says called upon the Drow's innate ability and summoned a globe. Yeah, we know that. We know it's their innate ability. You can stop saying that every single time that one of them does it. Or the fact that almost the entire thing takes place in one city, Menzoberranzan. And while it goes to a couple other places, it never goes to another city. You can at least occasionally shorthand it as just the city. You don't have to fully write out Menzoberranzan every single frickin' time. The lack of shorthand and the recycling of descriptors that we already know that this thing is what those adjectives are, so you don't have to attach the adjectives to the thing every time you say it. That is in there. So that's what I mean by overwritten. It is, I don't know if it got better as it went along or if I just kind of got used to it. I'm inclined to think it's a little bit more the latter. And obviously it didn't deter me reading it as a teenager, but I tell you, as an adult who has written and knows some of the traps that are easy to fall into, I'm reading that going, oh, wow, an editor should have told him like to dial it back a little. And again, it's not that the writing is bad. It's just excessive. And these full lengthy descriptors get used way more than is necessary. Again, especially to re-describe things we've already had described. So yeah, there's a bit of that. But ultimately at its heart, the stuff that I remember being good is very good. The characters are very well fleshed out. It manages a pretty good trick of having most of the drow have at least some distinction in terms of their personality, even though other than Drizzt and Zaknafein, the vast majority of them have very similar personalities because that's kind of what living in this society does to them. But there are still little moments that give some distinction. And the moments that I remember, like the really clear moments of just thinking like, oh, that's good. Those are still there and they're still good. So R.A. Salvatore hits plot beats hard that need to be hit hard. Like a lot of my favorite stuff are just simple things like described in plain terms, and then like there's one line of dialogue to cap it off, and that's the stuff that like I really remembered as opposed to the way more overwritten stuff. So he can go a bit more, I guess, minimalist when he wants to, and he'll sometimes do that to punctuate a moment or punctuate a scene. But you know, getting there, it's going to be a little overdone. Getting to that button on the thing, which will be the part that you remember, and that's real good. So it is funny going back to it. You know what? Something that I feel like I should mention, because this definitely wasn't something I realized at the time, and this isn't something I want to dwell on. I'm just gonna mention it to make people aware that I am aware, because I don't want people to think that I don't know. There is some discourse around the questionable origins of the drow in terms of their place in Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms, etc. If you don't know what I'm talking about, while they are frequently depicted at this point more as kind of a purple tone, you get that in games like Baldur's Gate. They are frequently described in this book and from around this time and prior to this time as either simply dark-skinned or ebony. And ebony is not purple. And their original descriptor in the very first time they were mentioned in the original Monster Manual in 1977 was as black elves. And if you don't see that maybe there's a little bit of an issue with the darker-skinned version of an innately good and wise race being innately wicked, violent, and untrustworthy, it is what it is. I'm not going to dwell, as I said, like a full breakdown and the history of that and what the D&D publishers have done to try and mitigate that over time as things have moved forward. Somebody else can do a better breakdown of that than I can. But just be aware that I am aware. Because at the time that this came out, you could make the argument that Drizzt was one of the good ones. You know, a notion that has its own issues. But I kind of want to circle back to what I said about Drizzt not coming across as a Mary Sue, because he easily could have. Like, for how skilled he is, he easily could have. But there's a couple of things. He does have a certain level of, it's initially naivete. His uncertainty and he doesn't just innately gravitate towards the very twisted morality of the society that he's been born into. And so initially he's a little naive about it, and then later, like, just having his own set of morals just makes things more difficult for him. It just does. And that's one way that the story keeps him from feeling like he's overpowered and just blasting through everything. There's also an appropriate amount of things that feel insurmountable. Not generally physical challenges. You get the sense he could probably take on any physical force that you throw at him, but like, he's in this city will it crush him? And the sense of the society feels a lot more insurmountable, even if individual threats thrown at him don't. So that's how it avoids feeling a little bit Mary Sue-ish or a little bit overpowered, as it were. So that helps certainly. The I think for the most part it works. There's if you overanalyze it, there's this weird notion that morals might be inherited because the only drow with any sense of morals other than Drizzt are Zach Nefane, who's his father, and Vierna, who is Zach Nefane's other kid. Now, Vierna's not actually a good person, but there are tiny hints that she's not as cruel as the rest of her sisters are. So, like, that's a weird notion. And also there's one beat that, like, I get why it's there, but it felt out of place in a way that Drizzt feeling reluctant to take a life doesn't. So, like, the idea that he just feels wrong about the idea of killing other people, even though, you know, everyone around him says that's the way it is here, like, that makes sense to me. I think it makes sense for someone to have an innate sense that life is of value. There is, however, a beat where, like, it gets weirdly sexually prudish. And so, like, I'm not saying that he should have joined in the spider cleric orgy. I get that he didn't. It makes sense to me that he didn't, but the rationale was a little weird. Because in my mind, it should just be like he doesn't want to be drawn more into everything that this represents, or is just blindsided by the nature of it. Hell, portray him as asexual and sex repulsed. I could buy that even. But instead he has this line, his rationale to his sister because he won't lay down with some random priestess. He's like, I do not love her. I'm like, wait a minute. Literally nothing about the world he lives in. Like, I can buy an innate sense of I shouldn't be killing intelligent beings, but like the sense that the equivalent of a teenager is going, no, only if I'm in love, when that has zero basis in anything going on around him or anyone. That felt a little weird and out of place as part of his moral compass. And I think is just, you know, I want to say 90s. Was it 90s or 80s this was actually published? When was this published? 90 exactly. So 90s moralizing. And I spent more time talking about that than it's actually worth. It's a quick moment. But like there would be little moments like that would throw me off. But the stuff that I remember, the bonding between him and the Panther Guinevere is wonderful. His sword fights with Zach Nefane are terrific. The general depiction and the sense of the very backstabbing politics that are at the heart of Menzoberranzan are intriguing and in a kind of a Game of Thronesy way. Like imagine if every powerful family in Game of Thrones was the Lannisters. That's kind of what this has going on a bit. And it is intriguing and it's easy to get pulled into. But as I said, the quality of the nuts and bolts of the writing, there's some issues in there that I certainly didn't notice at the time, but I'm noticing now as an adult. But for the most part, this does actually hold up. This was a good time. This was fun to revisit. I was not commissioned to take a look at the other two parts of the trilogy, though I imagine my experience would be largely just reiterative of what I'm saying about this, because I remember the general plot of those. So, yeah, I'm not sure I would get much more than I did out of the experience of rereading this. So, have you read this book or any of the other books with this character in them? Whatever your thoughts are on any of this, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, a like, share, and subscribe, they'll help me out. Don't worry too much about it, though. We take a relaxed attitude here, so you can just come on back next time you need a break. And now I'd like to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Renabi Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam RDL Taylor, Pal Barabajago, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. They're all calmer this time because they're eating papaya. Whatever works.